We'd like to introduce everybody Ken Kilbride, who is the CEO of ADHD Ireland. I'm going to find out what ADHD and what ADHD Ireland is all about. First of all, you're very welcome to Disability Matters, Ken.
Thanks very much, Sean. I appreciate the opportunity of coming along.
It's our pleasure to have you, as usual. Can you start by telling us a bit about ADHD, including maybe if there's a cause?
And not necessarily a cause, but ADHD will be what's primarily genetic. And so what you see is that ADHD tends to run in families. And so if there's a child with ADHD, we're looking at one of the parents. If it's not one of the parents, we're looking at the grandparents or the aunties and uncles.
Okay.
But ADHD itself, it stands for you would attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Right.
So it's what's called a neurodevelopmental condition, i.e. a condition, i.e. we're born with it, i.e. it's genetic, and tends to last across the entire lifespan. So that's one of the first myths about the condition. And certainly, there is that perception out there that ADHD will be particularly boys,
Yeah.
and particularly young boys bouncing off walls, can't sit still, can't, things like that as well. So certainly that does, impact an awful lot of boys, but it's not the true and full picture of the condition. So within ADHD, what we do is we look at more the neural pathways. And so for people with ADHD, they have different chemical structures within the brain. So
Right.
there can be changes in dopamine and other chemicals called noradrenaline. And what we mean by that is that for 5% of the population that has a brain that has ADHD,
Right.
95% of the population has a brain that doesn't have ADHD. And so what I mean by that is, that it's basically like an operating system. It works one way. And so for people with ADHD, the brain works one way. For people with ADHD, it works slightly different. It's not better, not worse, just different. And in terms of those, how it works different, how you're looking at it, it's generally around what we call there's three main behaviors. There's the attention deficit. Now, it's not actually attention deficit per se, because people with ADHD have the same level of focus as anyone else. It's just the inability to maintain attention is the key driver.
Right.
So when someone with ADHD walks into a room, it's not that they're lack of focus, they see everything all at once. And it's the inability to maintain attention. So for particularly when a person with ADHD is not engaged or not interested in a task, the brain says, go off and find me something else that is. So there's always a challenge for... Sorry.
School must be terrible for these children.
Oh, yes, indeed, yes. And again, particularly, not saying the model now, it is changing, things are getting better. But the idea of having, any 10-year-old, let alone with ADHD or not, sitting down all day facing a board and looking at a teacher, not really the best idea in terms of, getting the best. So that's for all children, but particularly for children with ADHD. And again, we often say for children with ADHD, if a cat walks across the playground at the side of the window, that's far more interesting and engaging than anything the teacher can say. So again, we do an awful lot of work with teachers in terms of how you'd help and support a child with ADHD in the classroom, because that's really where it all starts and all begins in terms of getting the supports for people with ADHD. But just so you mentioned, so attention deficit, then there's the impulsivity, which is what we call around executive functioning. So executive functioning is like the regulator or the controller in the brain. And so there's, we all have thoughts going through our mind. And there's this little thing that goes, that's a good idea, not a bad idea. It should say this, shouldn't say this, do that. People with ADHD don't have that or have very poor executive functioning. Right. And so the thought comes in, doesn't get regulated straight out. And so that can get, into, they can be very chatty and very sociable, get into social groups, but, as other people notice this is becoming a problem, they can get out of the social groups just as quickly. And then the third behavior is the hyperactivity, which is on the go, driven by a motor all the time. So when you get these three behaviors together, generally what's called combined. Now you can have them separately, but generally the combined is by far the most popular presentation. So when you get the attention deficit, the impulsivity, and the hyperactivity together as a mix, and the important, really critical thing to say about this is you need to have it so that it's an impairment or a challenge in your life. We all forget things. We all forget things, whatever happens to be. That's not ADHD. It's when it's not that you can't find your keys. You don't know where you left the car. You don't, you have the money in your account, forgot to pay the bills. There's things like that for people that are ADHD. So it needs to be at a particular level that becomes a challenge or an impairment in your life. So when you get all them, then you can get a diagnosis of ADHD.
Very good. Now, I remember it. I'm of an age, of course.
Mm.
I remember it as
Makes two of us.
I remember it as bold boy syndrome.
Yes. Yeah.
When did it actually get classified as ADHD?
So it probably get classified back in the 1960s. And that's one of the other challenges we have around the name. As I say, it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we now know it's not an attention, a deficit of attention. It's also not a disorder. Basically what they were doing back then was, if it wasn't regarded as normal per se, it was disorder.
Yeah.
But we now know, as I was saying, at the top, that it's genetic. As long as there's been human beings, there's always been people with ADHD. So it's a normal part of human evolution. And again, we all know from, basic evolutionary theory that, if something isn't, favorable or working for the society, well, then it gets weeded out. But there's always been ADHD. So while we talk about the challenges with the condition, there's always strengths that go with it as well, which is why it stays in the human genome, because it does have a very important part. So for people with ADHD, these have been the game changers in society.
Yeah.
And so these are the people, 50,000 years ago, someone said, "What's on the other side of the hill? I'll go and look." Because that was the lack of executive functioning. And so again, 50,000 years ago, and you were walking across the savannah, and you were, there was this little creak of noise off in the distance. If you were just sitting there focused on something, you didn't notice that. But because you had this variable attention, and you notice this, the colors changed behind the grass in front of you. That was pretty valuable 50,000 years ago. Now society's changed an awful lot. Then we went from, the hunters into, the farmers, and you put up the wall so the animals didn't come in. But again, ADHD does have its challenges, but also has its strengths. And again, we know from the what's called the etiology, the makeup of ADHD, tend to make great entrepreneurs. People with ADHD tend to be very creative. Most comedians you meet will have ADHD.
Really?
A lot of singers, dancers, choreographers, graphic designers. The entire creative industries are generally fueled by people with ADHD.
I would not know
one of
that.
the sayings, yeah, that's the way the brain is working. We talk about that different operating system. So, creativity is simply our imagination has been defined as the ability to go through 99 solutions to get to the 100. So who has a brain that's already designed that? So the ADHD, well, no, that's not a great idea. Move on to the next one. Didn't like that one. Next one. Move on to the next. That's the way the brain actually works. And so people with ADHD, generality, I can't say for everybody, but as a generality, people with ADHD tend to be very creative, tend to be very imaginative. And so they tend to be, all across those industries. And again, entrepreneurs, when you go have this creativity, but you also have this lack of executive function. Right. So again, they have the great idea. And what do the rest of us do? We go, that's a great idea. Let's sit down and form a committee. The person with ADHD goes, that's a great idea. Off, go and do it. So again, you'll find a lot of entrepreneurs have ADHD.
Wow.
So again, tons of strength, beneficial to society, but there is also challenges that goes with it as well.
Tell us a few of the symptoms. Now, tell us a few of the symptoms probably that you wouldn't expect.
So what we say about ADHD is it's the A, not the H, that tends to affect people across the lifespan. Yeah. So what you find is that we say it's 5% of children, but 3% of adults. Now, what we mean by that is 5% of children, if they went to get the diagnosis, would get a diagnosis, and 3% of adults. But those people, why that it's gone down 40% from 5 to 3% is a change of 40%. What happened with that 40%? They still have ADHD. They still have that brain, but they've managed to learn to put in certain hints and tips and workarounds and creative ideas to get them through the day. That if they went to get the diagnosis, they wouldn't, but they still have ADHD.
Of course.
So again, what you're seeing is that it's the A, not the H, that tends to affect people. So people, manage as adults, the impulsivity and the hyperactivity. So what you find is for people with ADHD, because they're adults, and they have a gym membership. Not only do they have the gym membership, but they also have the rowing machine at home.
Right.
And they don't go for runs; they do ultra marathons. So they're using up the hyperactivity. And so that's how you find that people tend to manage it across the lifespan. But for adults, as they go from childhood into adulthood, as I say, it's the A, it's the attention deficit. So when they go into work, and did you not put in that report at the end of the month? Sorry, mind went on to something else. And so what you find is they're managing, the impulsivity, they're managing the hyperactivity, but it's the A that tends to cause the problems across the lifespan.
Very good. And do we know how many children in Ireland have the condition or the disorder, I should say?
We do. Now, there's sort of a little bit of a long answer to that.
Okay.
So we mentioned the figure there that it was 5%,
Okay.
which gives you about a figure of about 60,000 children. But actually, how many are diagnosed is another question. That we don't know.
All right.
So again, we estimate, we've talked to people about, could you give us an estimate? So we estimate it's maybe 20 to 50% of children with ADHD actually are getting assessed and treated for it.
Right.
So of that 60,000 children I just mentioned there, 20 to 30,000 are getting supported. More than likely, 30 to 40,000 aren't. So even while we have, the system out there, through CAMS and with the HSE, and there is, get private diagnosis, there's still an awful lot of more undiagnosed children with ADHD than there are diagnosed out there at the moment.
And I think you said earlier on, it's mostly boys.
No, it's genetic.
It?
So what you see is that it tends to be seen as boys. But because it's genetic, it's 50% boys, 50% girls.
Okay.
The girls don't get seen. In that age range, we were talking about there, where the primary to get the diagnosis, which is in primary school, ages of 8 to 12. What you see the diagnostic rate there is that maybe 4 times or 5 times more boys than girls get the diagnosis. The girls are getting missed. So what you see is the girls is that they tend to have a slightly different presentation. So the girls tend to have more of the inattentive ADHD. And so what they're doing is they're being quiet, they're being dreamy, sitting down the back of the class, not causing a problem. Whereas the boy tends to, and there's an old saying, girls internalize, boys externalize.
Yeah.
And so the boys are externalizing their ADHD, the hyperactivity, not sitting still in the classroom, bouncing off the walls, chatting incessantly, things like that as well. Teacher sees that. So again, boys get picked up an awful lot earlier than girls. Because the girls, ADHD is not what you call an intellectual disability. So again, as much well able to do classwork as anyone else. So they're getting through it, but they're just sitting down there being shy, dreamy, not causing a problem. So they're not getting picked up. Now, the challenge for girls for that is that, that leads to, social camouflaging like that as well, which can lead to anxiety and depression.
Right.
And so we'd often say that, if there's a girl, particularly going through puberty, 13, 14, 15, and presenting for anxiety or presenting for depression, also check for ADHD. That overlap there is so strong.
Very good. Tell us then, we have another problem when trying to diagnose the condition. A lot of conditions are very similar to ADHD.
Not that they're similar, but there's an awful lot of overlap.
Okay.
So we mentioned that ADHD was a neurodevelopmental condition. So that's again, there's a different way the brain works compared to other people that don't have the condition. But it tends to overlap with a lot of other conditions like autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, or DCD. And there's other conditions as well. And so, for instance, on figures like that as well, and there's they will say that, people with ADHD and ADHD as condition rarely travels alone. And so again, while you mightn't have the other condition at diagnostic level, like you go to the clinician and they say you have this as a diagnosis, but you might have lots of traits of it. And so again, you'll see that 70 to 80% of people with ADHD will have one other condition,
right.
30 to 40, 35 will have 2 other conditions, and 10 to 15 will have 3 other conditions. And so again, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia tend to be the main headline ones that mixed in there. And just generally what I would say about it is, what you see is that particularly for ADHD and autism, that they tend to be opposite ends of the same spectrum.
Right.
But a lot of people have an overlap there, and they meet in the middle on both.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah. It's a bit of a minefield,
Yes.
but that's what they're paid all those
Oh, those commissions
all
get
that
paid
big
for,
money
yes.
for.
Yep, yep.
A diagnosis then for parents of a child must be a relief. Now I know what little Tommy or little Johnny, why they behave like they
Like
behave.
that, yeah.
That's
So
brilliant.
again, the more extreme point on that is, there's certainly that there. I mean, as you mentioned there earlier, that ADHD would be seen, as the naughty child syndrome, the bold child, the brat, things like that as well. Not as a real condition, a little bit more discipline and sorted out. But we now know because of work done with, through neurology and things like that as well, and taking MRI scanners and brains, we know that people have different makeup in the brain. Um, so again, we need to get that type of information out there so that people can understand that it is a real condition, and when you give help and supports, it can make life better for people.
Very good. And what about treatment?
So ADHD is a little bit different. We mentioned other conditions in the neurodevelopmental spectrum, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and ADHD. What makes ADHD a little bit different than those other conditions is there can be medication that works for some people with the condition. Now, just to say that it is really, really critically important, I've never met a psychiatrist who hasn't said this. A medication will never solve ADHD by itself.
Okay.
So just important, ADHD medication can help. It'll never solve it by itself. So again, the best outcomes are usually delivered by what's called a multimodal approach, which for people who would be severe or moderate ADHD, which is a combination of medication and behavior management, OT, speech and language therapy, conditions like that as well. So
Right.
it's really, really important that you get the two of them together, and not just one by itself. And it's also important to say, for children and for adults, that both guidelines will say that the first intervention is the non-medical management of ADHD. Can you manage it with, for children, can you put in the speech and language therapy, the OT, the behavioral management, other conditions like that? Same for adults. But if that isn't working, it isn't producing results, let's try medication then as well.
Very good. And we've spoken, let's say, to maybe 1,000 people over the years, all from organizations supporting people with a
Yep.
disability. And in almost all cases, treatment does not only include medication.
Oh yeah, yeah.
A
So very
vast
important.
amount of other stuff is
Mm.
even more helpful,
Yes.
which
So
is
it's important to say that
brilliant.
about ADHD, but there is just when I say that point, that you just repeat that, is that it is part of the neurodevelopmental spectrum.
Yeah,
But what makes it different than, say, autism, dyslexia, and dyspraxia is that there can be medication that works for some people, which makes it a little bit more different. We would certainly be coming from the social model, in terms of saying that, the challenges, we'll always say this about ADHD, the biggest challenge with ADHD, not having ADHD, is the way society reacts to people with ADHD and not having the supports there to help them. But we also have, half a foot in the medical camp as well,
yeah,
in that medication response is there as well.
yeah, of course, yeah. Now, if we move on to ADHD Ireland, when did that come on stream?
So the green shoots first sprouted back in 1980, to be honest.
Wow,
So again, like an awful lot of organisations, I'm sure you've talked to over the years, it was a couple of parents got together over a kitchen
right,
table, and said, there's nothing out there. At the time, there didn't know it was for adults as well. There's nothing out there in Ireland for our children. If we don't do something about it, no one else will. And so again, the organisation was sort of voluntary for about 35 years until about the 2015, 2016. At that stage, it would have become what's called a Section 39
very good.
with the HSE. And so again, we started getting funding from them for that. And so now we've gone from, a point, back 2015, 10 years ago, where we one and a half staff, we've now up to about 20.
Oh,
And so again, just seeing, the how ADHD has been now seen in Irish society, and, and supported, that way it wasn't, even up to 10 years ago.
brilliant. And what services do you provide?
So again, we have a basic principle or model of the way we work with the HSE. And so what they do is they provide the assessment and the treatment, i.e. the medical management of ADHD, whether
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
medication or not. But we provide what's called the psychosocial supports. So we do the support groups for parents, the support groups for adults, the engagement for children, and we do the parenting courses, the adult courses, and we do awareness talks for organizations. That range. The other side, around the what's called the psychosocial supports or psychoeducation supports for the condition. As we mentioned earlier, that medication by itself will never resolve ADHD. So again, just for instance, what the guidelines will suggest, and that the first intervention for a child 6 to 12 with ADHD is not medication; it's a parental training course. So again, when you understand what ADHD is, you can support the child with the condition. And so again, we provide courses for parents, to do that. And I said we have courses for adults. So again, it's a wide range. So we do about 600 events across the year.
Wow.
So we've 10, 15 events on every week. And they're always different. So again, forgive me, but go on to adhdireland.ie, have a look at our event section. And again, we don't look for a piece of paper to say you have a diagnosis or not, because we know, particularly for adults, there's a very low rates out there of the 160,000 that do have the condition. And again, 95% of the stuff we do is free as well.
Very good. I read through a wonderful piece of information, a strategic plan. That was
Yes.
wonderful. Now, I think maybe you could explain what it's all about.
So as I say, we have got bigger over the years, and so we've now got to the point. Now we always had a strategic plan, but so we've had to come together and look at how we're doing things, and put in processes now that we didn't have to put in processes years ago. And one of these, in terms of the good governance code, would be having a fully active strategic plan. So we did have one that ran out a couple of years ago, ran out during the middle of COVID, to be honest. Again, at that stage, we rather than write a new 5-year plan, because obviously, there wasn't a clear view on what 5 years ahead meant in the middle of COVID. And so we had a couple of years on that. So we've gone out and we've engaged with stakeholders, and we've engaged with our membership, the HSE, other organizations, UCD, Trinity, and what do you think? Where is ADHD going? And so on the basis of that, we put together a new strategic plan that takes us from 2026 into up to 2030. And again, the big thing for ourselves about that is that we're looking for a future where ADHD is celebrated. And so, we've changed our mission and our values slightly. Our mission is still to make life better for people with ADHD, and how we do that. But one of the things we've talked about there is, that we've talked about the challenges, and the acceptance part of ADHD. But when we start celebrating ADHD in Irish society, and we're putting in the supports for people with the condition, without having, it's naturally built into the system. And so it's not just, you have to go and fight for it. And that, organizations, employers, schools, universities know that about 5% of the people coming through their service will have ADHD, and they'll go, well, look, we've thought about this in advance. Here's the accommodations we have. Let's see what we can put in to help work to make this the best experience and get the best out of it for you as well. So
that's fantastic. What about the European projects? Now, you do a lot of work in Ireland, but now you're sprouting your wings.
Yes. And so we do a range of European projects. So we finished up one there last year. The partners would have been the University of Cyprus and some organizations in Greece. And we developed a guidebook for adults with ADHD. So again, that's freely available on our website. If you're an adult, all the information is there for you. And we're currently in the middle of a project called Drive. And so this is a project that's been led by the University of Prague. It has a range of partners all across Europe. But the idea behind this, and you mentioned that a lot of entrepreneurs tend to have ADHD. It's for people that will be working with vocational trainers who will be working with people in their system on how to support people with ADHD to be entrepreneurs, and so they can do their best through that. So we hope to have that. It's coming to the end of that project, and so we will have a couple of events coming up towards October, November, now to launch the guide and the workbook and things like that as well. So, but again, that's going to be done in 500 or 600 countries across Europe at the same time. And so again, that's going to be a big project that we're just coming to the conclusion of.
Now, earlier you mentioned that you have an ADHD-friendly school plan.
Mhm.
That's very interesting. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a bit about that?
So what I was saying there is that, in terms of, that neurodiversity paradigm and, spectrum that we were talking about earlier. So again, in terms of, our mission, as mentioned, is to make life better for people with ADHD. So for ourselves, we sat down, we thought about, where and how does that happen? And so as I was mentioning earlier, for ourselves, the first place that happens in schools. And again, we mentioned that the diagnostic rate for boys tends to be much higher than girls at that age. And again, what you find is that the first place it tends to be seen is the teacher.
Yeah.
And so again, what the child does at home and has been always doing at home is what you regard this is how the child behaves at home. It's only when they go into this sort of different social setting of the classroom where they have to there's 25, 26 other children and that the behavior looks different. So the teacher's usually the first one that sees it, to be honest. And so again, if we can get the teachers to support the child in the classroom, well, that's going to make a huge difference across the entire lifespan. Because they're going to bring those supports into university, they're going to bring those supports and acceptance into the workplace. And so we've developed a schools program to help and support teachers, to know what ADHD is, what it looks like in the classroom, and how you support them in a neuroaffirmative way, and so that they can learn to the best of their abilities. Again, just in terms of schools, and this has been in practice for a number of years, that that the idea is that the school wraps around the child, rather than the child fitting into the
Yeah.
school. Now, forgive me, but there isn't always the supports, the budgets, the teachers, the training to do that. And so again, we love teachers, but sometimes there is information and supports that needs to get out there. So we've developed that through our what's called our SAP, which is a schools accreditation program, to help the schools become ADHD friendly. Because as I mentioned, ADHD is a 5% prevalence rate, and the average class size now is 25-30, which means for every teacher in every class, more than likely there's going to be at least one child with ADHD there. So it's how you can help support them to do that in a way that works for not only you, but for the child as well.
Brilliant. That's where I think SNA is a fantastic.
Yes.
It's a fantastic program.
Yeah.
Now, added to all that, you have some progressive programs. Tell us a bit about those.
So, I mean, just for instance, one is called UMAP, which is the Understanding and Managing Adult ADHD program. So, while we mentioned that there's maybe 60,000 children, there's probably 150, 160, 170,000 adults in Ireland with the condition.
Yeah.
And so it's only in the last 2021, 5 years, that the HSE has started providing services for adults with ADHD. So again, the plan is to have a number of clinics around the country. They've set up an awful lot of them, 8 or 9 of them, but none of them are fully staffed. And so again, a lot of them have long wait lists. Some of them have actually closed their wait lists. And what we found coming out of COVID, particularly for adults, was that they started seeing the executive functioning challenges coming to the fore. And so the example of that was previous to COVID, even if they did have ADHD and it was undiagnosed, they were able to get through the days because they were in a structured environment. You went to work for 9 o'clock in the morning, you got the same bus, you had the same things in the morning, you went to work, you did the job, and you had your lunch at 1 o'clock, you came home, whatever you did. So they had a very structured environment. Then what happened is, COVID shook everything upside down, to be honest. Put people with ADHD in a snow globe. And so again, what they were finding was, they then had to start self-managing their days, and they had to do things like that as well, and homeschool the children at the same time. So an awful lot of people coming through ADHD, through COVID, and said, there's something challenging my life that I can't quite put my finger on. And then again, you saw a huge amount of celebrities coming out in the last number of years, and you'll see an explosion on social media, TikTok, Instagram, people saying, I now have the condition, talking about their symptoms. And so it's been ticking an awful lot of boxes for people in the last number of years. So we've been working with the HSE to revise the plan for adults. And so again, an awful lot of work done there, but certainly more to be done going forward.
Very good. Now, Ken, we just run out of time.
Ah,
Before we go, I'd ask you just to give out that website again in case anyone wants to get in touch.
so if you want to get in touch, volunteer, find information about what we do, or the 600 events that we're running every year, simply go to adhdireland.ie.
Great. Ken, thanks so much for talking to us at Disability Matters.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.